London Calling, the 1979 double album from The Clash. We'll be looking at that album and the song London Calling from that album as well. The Clash is one of those revolutionary bands that really packed a punch with punk and just a no-nonsense attitude. In this episode, we'll also be talking to Peter Field from the band Peter 118, a Christian punk band over in the UK that has really kind of gained some notoriety for various few reasons. This episode was fun, folks. Buckle up, stay tuned, we're ready to rock.
Welcome to the Song and Verse Podcast, a discovery of God's Word, one song and a few verses at a time. Here's your host, Rockin' Odd Todd.
Hello and welcome to the Song and Verse Podcast, a discovery of God's Word through song and verse. I am your host, Rocking Odd Todd, and we're so glad you've decided to join us today. You know, there's revolutionary moments in music and bands that just take things to a completely different level, and The Clash was one of those bands in the punk scene. There were certain bands out there that just totally revolutionized everything, from different genres to new movements to recreating certain genres into something different. And punk is one of those genres that sort of came in waves and introduced new ways of expression. The Clash was one of those bands, Sex Pistols, Dead Kennedys, Misfits. Oh man, the list goes on and on of bands that fit firmly into this category, all the way up to Green Day, Offspring, and that particular type of band. Peter 118 is a Christian band that's been totally influenced by that same movement, and it was awesome to sit down and talk with Peter Field, the lead singer and guitarist of that band, about what punk means and what it's really all about from a Christian standpoint as well. And to take that no-nonsense kind of attitude and just not be afraid of the truth and willing to speak the truth is something that should be evident in all music and all forms of communication. So it was really awesome to sit down with Peter and get a first-hand account of what Peter 118 has been through, and their story's pretty amazing. So I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion just as much as I did. All right, with that, we have Peter from Peter 118 with us today. How's it going, man?
Hi. It's going well. I'm here in the UK and England.
Awesome. Well, it is so cool to have you, man. I'm always excited to have guests from across the pond and different parts of the world. You know, it gets a little old always talking to the American side of things. I love hearing from all over the world. So this is great, man. So I want to hear a little bit more about Peter 118. Tell me how that all came about, what the band, what the name means and everything else.
Okay, so Peter 118 is a Christian punk band. We're here in the UK. The name comes from Psalm 118, Psalm 118, that we play to God and not to man. We don't look for human idols. So we go into secular bars and clubs and proclaim the gospel through Christian punk music. And in the UK, there isn't many Christian alternative bands. I would say about 8 in the whole country. So, the bands we have, we kind of have to work together, to work as the body of Christ.
And what other bands are those that you guys work with quite often?
Well, there's a band called The Ministries. We did the Blood on the Hands tour with them last year. We do have a lot of US bands coming over as well. So at my church, we put on a lot of gigs.
Right.
So, we had Chaotic Resemblance come over and they played with ourselves and the Ministries. There's a UK band called Draw. They were a 2-piece band. They're really good. There's a band called Conduit. So, we just have to keep going.
Awesome, man. Awesome. So, we talked to Chris Dobie from Not Your Typical Christian a few episodes back, and I was really interested in the fact that, he was talking about the Christian faith they're not as open in the UK about it. It's a lot more like there's still people that go to church, but they don't openly talk about it, so to speak. So what is different for you? What said, hey, man, we're going to go out there. We're going to be a Christian band. And this is what I believe in. This is what I want to do. How did that all kind of come about?
I was from the secular punk scene. So
Mm-hmm.
I used to be in a non-Christian band called Senseless. And we used to party and club and fight and drink. And I had a conversion to Christianity. So about 2006, the tours ended with my punk band called Senseless. And then I became a Christian, and I gave punk music up and joined a church and did worship. And then I also developed tinnitus in my right ear, which tinnitus is like ringing, it's damage from music. But God healed me and then sent me back out into the punk scene under Peter 118. So, we just go out there, proclaim the message, proclaim truth, and don't let fear stopping us.
That's interesting though. So how did you come about the faith like that? Coming from that punk scene, what was that conversion moment? Like what happened to make that?
I just kept getting this weird grace in my head. So I'd be driving down the road and I keep getting the word grace. So, and I didn't really understand what grace was.
Mm-hmm.
So, I joined the local church and I kind of learned about what grace is, and then, committed to Jesus, and, things started to happen that way, really.
That's crazy, man. That is so awesome to hear. And it's so interesting how like each person kind of comes into their own story and how it happens, but there's like always kind of like this parallel that's there at the same time. It's like, you may have come into the faith a little bit differently than somebody else, but ultimately the same calling was there, and the same, he works the same way in many ways, but just very differently at the same time, which is so crazy and so hard to wrap your mind around sometimes, to see that, especially with you being brought back into the fold with the punk scene, because, when I think of punk, of course I think of the U.S. bands, like the Ramones, the Dead Kennedys, Misfits, Green Day, Stooges, stuff like that. But of course, the punk in the UK is very different. The Clash, Crass, the Banshees, Adam and the Ants, stuff like that. And the interesting thing to me is punk has a no nonsense kind of feel about it. A lot of people turn to music for like this happy go lucky escape from the world kind of thing, and punk is more real. Punk's more raw. Punk deals with what's actually going on in life. And is that the same slant that drew you to punk, and is that what you kind of use in your Christian form
I
too?
I think the question for truth. Punk questions society. It questions society's norms. Like in the 70s, the Sex Pistols were challenging. It was a cultural revolution. Punk was in the UK in the 70s. So the Sex Pistols were challenging the cultural norm of society. The higher class, the working class, and that's kind of what got me interested in punk. So I come at it as from now a Christian angle, that we proclaim the message, and that's kind of what I do. We get a lot of stick for it. Because the punk scene isn't in the UK, they're not used to Christian punk, so it's kind of it's different for them. I've been banned from a lot of like the punk Facebook groups, and we've had kind of threats, to don't go for certain festivals. But in reality, it's just kind of like the threats have just been like on Facebook, social media. In person, people come up to us, they're quite interested in what we do.
Well, but that's kind of funny to like be banned, because that's almost anti-punk in a way. It's like
See what happened. There's a Facebook group called UK Pop Punk of 16,000 people. Now in 2018, they changed their name to Peter 118. It's kind of as a joke. It's kind of like take the Mickey out of Peter 118 because we're Christians, but kind of the joke first, because it exposed Peter 118 to 16,000 pop punk kids. So then, people, automatically knew overnight who we were. Our YouTube views went up by about 4,000 overnight. And then we were invited to play this gig, that gig. We got a booking agent, and people wanted, were just generally interested. So it kind of opened up a wider door.
That's so crazy.
And they kind of did that for a while. And, because we were kind of like, they turned Peter 118 into like a UK pop punk meme. But when they actually realised that we're actually a serious band, that's when they banned us, because they didn't like, my views on pro-life. They didn't like my other political views, or my views on the gospel.
Sure.
So we got banned from a lot of gigs, and I had a message come through saying, if you go to this festival, you're going to get punched in the face. And I thought, well, I'm not going to let fear intimidate me. So I went to the festival, and actually I wasn't threatened. I had a lot of support coming up to me.
Well, I've kind of noticed that, and the more I talk to, a lot of bands and a lot of people that step out in faith, if you walk in the love of Christ and treat others the way that they would want to be treated, most people don't mess with you. It's it's really kind of eye opening when you see that kind of dialogue taking place. And like you said, it's all about that fear element. And are you going to let fear drive the narrative, or are you going to let, the Spirit of Christ drive the narrative? And that's a big driving point for me, especially now. You and I talked a little bit off camera about some punk bands and things of that nature. And of course the Clash is huge across all punk narratives, UK, US, worldwide punk. When you think of punk, you think of the Clash. And, we talked a little bit about the song London Calling, and 1977 is when that one came out, I think.
Yeah.
And to me, it's like almost like a newscast, so to speak. It's like reading out all these events taking place in the world, and, how they feel about those things and what they mean to them. But, what does that song mean to you? And do you bring some of the Clash into your writing? Like, are they an inspiration in many ways, but you just put a Christian slant on some of that? Or like, what kind of influence do you guys have?
Well, definitely musically, you would hear the Clash influence and a lot of the British influence. I grew up in the 90s, listening to Green Day, Rancid, Offspring, but I also listened to a lot of the old school punk, Sex Pistols, Clash, Stiff Little Fingers.
Sure.
So you can definitely hear that. And, the song London Calling, if I'll read you the lyrics, because what they were writing about in the late 70s, it sounds like they're writing about it now. So It says that the chorus, London calling to the faraway town, now war to declare, battle calm down. The ice age is coming, the sun's zooming in, meltdown expected, the wheat is growing thin. Now, it sounds like that's what's happening now, because you're having this political war. The ice age is coming. It sounds like, with COVID, everything going down, we're coming into lockdown, meltdown, that people are melting down because of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And the wheat is growing thin. People's income is being affected by lockdown, by COVID-19. So what the Clash were writing about in the 70s, London Calling, I think is quite relevant, to today. Even today,
yeah. And so, going down the COVID trail a little bit, how much has that affected you guys over in the UK? I mean, you guys are locked in again, aren't you? Quarantined with.
Yeah, we've just gone into a national lockdown for 4 weeks. So back in March, we had a lockdown from March to like April, May, June. We came out of it in the summer, and then we've gone back into a national lockdown. So it's affected the band in many ways. We've had all our gigs cancelled. A lot of venues are now shutting down. We can't use the studio. The studios are shut. So we kind of, when it opened up in the summer, we could, I did one acoustic gig, but it's kind of shut down the music and, industry. So we're kind of, writing songs from home and doing things virtually at the moment.
With the lockdown, are they still allowing people to work, or is it?
It does affect some people's work.
Right.
I work in the public sector, so and my wife works at a school, so we're doing that. But if you were, work in the tourist sector or the pub sector, a lot of people are losing their incomes and jobs. That's kind of what's happening, and they're getting furlough, so the government pays them 80% of the wage.
And it's interesting because we've talked to so many entertainers. I mean, this is crushing the sports and entertainment industries. I don't know what the new normal is going to be. I don't know what we're heading towards as far as people ever really coming out again. And that's a scary thought. And I hope that that's not true. But they're talking about mask mandates and everything over here. And I think Ticketmaster even came out and said that if you're going to go to a show, you have to be vaccinated or something is what they're looking at down the road.
Yeah.
And,
what about bringing in the vaccine?
Yeah. And it's like, man, you talk about freedoms and liberties, really in jeopardy at this point. It's just interesting because, you talk about a test of faith at this point in time, like you said earlier on in this conversation. And I think it's kind of the driving narrative that I'm sort of seeing here is fear. Are you going to live your life in fear, or are you going to live it through the Spirit and through faith?
No, I think you're right. I think we've got, fear, fear is a weapon of the enemy. Mm-hmm. So with Jesus, we can overcome fear.
Yeah, definitely. So tell me a little bit about the band members. Like what is your core? From the videos and stuff I've seen, you've got maybe a girl that kind of sings too?
Yeah, we have had a change in lineup. So my wife Janine was the bass player in Peter 118, but we've recently had a baby, Daisy. So Janine's kind of stepped down from the bass.
Sure.
And then we brought in Andy, and he's been with us, coming up to 18 months and been doing live gigs. And we've got Alisha as a backing singer. And we just recruited a new guitarist, Lee, on the guitars. So we're kind of, going for, a new kind of heavier sound. So
sweet. So the interesting part about music for me is, of course, I was born in 77. So I was born when this song was released. And, grew up in the 80s, 90s, and music sort of fit into punk, hard rock, metal. You had very few genres, and now you've got new metal, death metal, thrash metal. You've got all these different genres. Is punk the same way? Does punk have multiple genres, or do people just say, look, we're punk?
No, it does have genres, and the genres fight within themselves. So you've got the old school punk, you've got the pop punk, you've got ska punk, hardcore punk. So, and
that's I guess that's what's always been kind of interesting to me, because with punk, they Billy Idol, David Bowie, Blondie, they were all kind of roped in there. And I was like, to me, that's not quite punk, but I guess it is pop punk.
Yeah, I think because there was two waves of punk, in the 70s and 80s. So you had the original punk bands like the Sex Pistols, Blondie, the Clash, the Ramones, and then in the 80s along comes hardcore punk. Bands like Discharge, GBH, The Exploited. So now you've got a mixture of the 70s punk and the later 80s punk, with the mohawks and the studded jackets. So
it's pretty wild to watch how these genres sort of evolve over time, because, you get 20, 30 years out and they don't even look anything like they look to begin with in some ways, even Green Day and a few of those other bands, they got so much heavier that you could still see the roots there, but it wasn't necessarily the classic punk sound, so to speak. But the same message and the same attitude. I guess that's what the driving force really kind of is. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think what I have noticed, there's a lot of political influence at the moment with what's going on with with the US elections, with COVID. So politics is really entwined into punk music at the moment, and you got to be careful to try and stay away from that debate, or it'll be ongoing.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And that's something we've talked and touched on a little bit with this ministry is, look, I have my own personal opinions. You're probably not going to hear me talk about them, because I see this as a body of Christ, and that's a division. That's a line that really kind of divides. Now, if you have a personal discussion with me one-on-one, I'll probably tell you exactly how I feel. But from a ministry standpoint, I don't expect a pastor up in the pulpit to take political sides. Now, I do expect him to take social sides on some things that we've already talked about with abortion and things of that nature. but not necessarily who I should be voting for. And I think that's a huge disservice. When we start to play that game, I think we can talk about the issues, but not necessarily what we think of people that believe one way or the other, because then we start alienating people. And I really don't think that's what Christ was all about. So
no, we've got to try and bring unity.
Yeah, definitely. And through the Spirit, not through the government.
Yeah.
And it's so funny how, the same constructs that create all this vitriol and hate and just sort of separation are the same constructs that they think we should all come together through. And I'm just like, that makes no sense whatsoever, So you mentioned that your wife was the bass player at one point and, is now off, working with the baby. You guys have what, a 10, 11 month old? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay.
Daisy will be, should be 1 in 27th of November. So
awesome. And so how do you navigate that? And do you feel like your wife is on hiatus forever, or will she be back a part of the band at some point? I guess that's kind of touchy territory.
Yeah, it's been a strange time because we had the baby and then we went into lockdown. So in terms of what we were doing in the band, all the gigs were stopped. So it's kind of allowed me time to be a father to Daisy,
which is totally a blessing at the same time, isn't it?
Yeah. So instead of being out gigging at the weekend, I've been here with Daisy and I've watched her grown up, and that's helped with me working at home. So we'd have to see for the future of whether or not Janine wants to come back in the band, because she's been doing a lot of the childcare when I'm out, doing the ministry work.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I've talked with a lot of entertainment industry people, a lot of bands, tech workers, lights, all that kind of stuff. And fortunately, a good portion of them are still finding work if that's their full-time gig. If it's not their full-time gig, then a lot of them are still working. But that's the story I keep hearing is, as hard as this has been, a lot of people have been able to take a step back and really kind of look at life and prioritize things a little bit differently. And, in many ways, it's been a bit of a sabbatical or a blessing in some ways. But at the same time, of course, there's been that stressful element to it and not being out in the public. But it's interesting how God throws us little curveballs every now and then and really kind of helps us with the priorities that maybe we, weren't thinking of to begin with. Because I'm the same way, man. When we locked down here in March, I was pretty much, refined home with like 5 kids, teaching them online school. And I'm like, what am I doing? And so, but at the same time, it was such a blessing to be on top of that, see what's going on, know more about what they're up to, and just really kind of refine that relationship a little bit. Not that it was ever bad, but it just kind of,
priority.
Really
redefines
that.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I think COVID's allowed that time so we can kind of, prioritize things. And, it's been great for us because, I've been working from home since March. I've only been going into the office, 1 day a week. So I've kind of seen Daisy grow up. Where usually I'd be in the office 5 days a week and then at weekends away gigging. So it's just allowed that time, to be as a family, and I'll take advantage of that.
Yeah, definitely. That's it. So, and I think that's part of our faith. Part of our faith is always finding or looking for the positive in the negative, and really, really being able to figure out what's going on here. What's the bigger picture? And knowing that you're not in control is kind of a reality check as well. So, the interesting part of London Calling is at the very end of that song, apparently there's a series of beeps that are kind of spelling SOS out there. And, I guess he did that with his pickups or with the guitar or whatnot. And when I see that song, I also kind of hear a calling of the saints, so to speak, to step up. And of course, I know that's not what the Clash was really going for, but there's this old hymn by the name of "Onward Christian Soldiers," marching into marching into battle, carrying the banner of the Lord, basically that kind of deal. As these events are taking place and as they transpire, it's as if I see us being called to stand above the fray, so to speak, and to carry a different mantra and a different banner than what the world's carrying. Do you see a little bit of that element there?
Yeah, I think definitely. SOS, we need help from Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, with COVID, a lot of our churches have closed down in the UK, but because we weren't allowed to do indoor services, but our church could do outdoor services. So for about 8 weeks, we were doing outdoor services, by the high street, and people driving past because I could actually see the service.
Yeah,
it was encouraging more people than being stuck in the four walls of a building.
mm-hmm.
And the church was quite interesting because it led to doing a food bank and a clothing bank, and then a company came along and gave them a van. So
wow.
I'm on the church leadership, so they've been given a brand new van and with insurance paid. So if we need any gigs doing, I'm sure the church wouldn't mind lending the van to Peter 118. So God's provided, and that, but we've had to step up and do things differently. So instead of being inside the church, we've gone out of the walls.
I mean, how cool is that though? Because our church has done the same thing here, and you could probably hear it. You could probably hear the service within a 3 or 4 mile radius. And so you could sit on your front porch and basically hear the singing and the message. And boy, you really kind of hit that on the head there, talking about breaking outside of the four walls, because that's what we're called to do. That service on Sunday morning should be a rally cry to take out everything that you've talked about into the world. It should be your mission field as soon as you step out of those doors and,
definitely
hit the streets. And so, you talk about the ministry of Peter 118. How does that look? So what's a typical gig like after and before? Like you mingle quite a bit with the crowd? How does that work?
Yeah, well, all through the night. So we'd arrive there, set the gear up, and we'd end up doing a lot of the ministering to a lot of the bands. So we did a gig with a band. They were quite big, in Australia and in the Far East. So they came to the UK to do a tour, and I think they were expecting a big turnout at the gig. So we did this gig in Manchester, but only a handful of people turned up, and the band was kind of a bit disappointed. So what we did as a band, was carry all the gear to the vans, and to encourage them, thanking them to come to our country. Thank you to coming to the UK, and it kind of developed that relationship, but also kind of encouraged them. So even though they were kind of discouraged by the numbers, we tried to bring in a bit of positivity for them.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, because I think a lot of people miss that avenue, that as a band on a stage, you have access to those other bands usually, to where you're able to show them, lifestyle. Say, look, this is how we do it. We're a little bit different, and a lot of times you don't even need any words or just preaching, actions, so to speak.
Actions. They notify our actions.
Yeah, and it raises questions, and they're like, why, what's the difference? And I'm sure you've seen conversations start from that. Am I correct?
Yeah. I've, a lot of bands, in 2018 were kind of, because it was all going on in the UK pop punk scene and Facebook, a lot of people were interested to see what we're actually like. And there was this band from Wales that we were touring with, and they said, well, actually, you guys are okay. So kind of the message that people get drilled into their head from social media and Facebook is different than when they actually meet us in person. We were getting a lot of positive messages, these are nice guys. And, so we had non-Christians defending us against a lot of, abuse and attack on social media.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of interesting how that all works out too, because not too many people argue with the gospel when it's presented with love and the way that it's intended. You know, the two major commandments that we push here, but I mean, they came straight from Christ, were to love God and love people. And if you're not walking in those, then you might want to recheck what it is you're doing. If the fruits of the Spirit don't line up with the ministry you're walking out, then that might be an issue. And I see a lot of that. I see a whole bunch of just judgment and condemnation coming from folks that that's just not what we're called to do, I guess is the way to say it. And there's a difference between walking in relationship with a friend or a brother and doing your best to intervene and help a little bit, but to just walk up to some Joe Blow off the street and tell him what he should be doing, that's that's kind of a not exactly the way that I think it's supposed to be walked out. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think we have to show love, because you can't win people to Jesus through morals and moral arguing, because that won't work, because that'll get people's defenses up.
Yeah,
so I just do by our actions, by our love.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I don't think words necessarily do it. I think walking with somebody in relationship, sort of taking their hand, really trying to figure out who they are and just loving on them opens way more doors than pointing fingers and shouting,
Yeah,
and I think we do a pretty rough job as a church sometimes with that, and don't necessarily understand that part of it,
Yeah.
And that's just a hypothetical global church aspect. But that is something I really want to ask you, about over there in the UK. What's the church experience like? Modern hymns? How is your church? And what denomination? Is it a denomination or not?
Yeah, well, our church, it was Church of England. They've come out away from the Church of England and going into like a Pentecostal route. But church numbers are quite low. So, at the moment, 15 to 20 people. And then another church I went to, below 60. So we don't
is
have
that just because of COVID, or is that in general?
No, that will be outside of COVID.
Okay.
So we don't have mega churches in the UK. So a good church attendance would probably be about 100, 150. And not all churches are pulling in those numbers. A lot of churches are closing down, and the government wants to turn them into mosques. So, some churches are getting 8 people, 10 people, because not everyone goes to church. The UK has become secular, it's become liberal. So God isn't in society as much like it is in America.
Yeah.
It might be happening in parts of America as well, like liberalism coming in and secularism. But that's kind of, the experience, what's happening here.
Now, is there a lot of Islamic roots taking hold too?
Yeah, we have a lot of mosques, a lot of Muslims. So that, that's kind of, that.
Yeah, I don't know necessarily where this goes and where it pans out. It's interesting that growing up, was it the same way, or is this really kind of taken place in the last 10, 20 years, the transformation of the church over there?
I think the church has become more modern, and I think the UK church is reaching out to younger people, but I think it's a general trend in society.
Yeah.
And if you hold Christian views or values, you're classed as being right-wing or racist.
With the Church of England, how much of that is still controlled by like the royal family and stuff? Are they still real involved in that?
Well, the Queen is the head of the Church of England.
Okay.
So I used to go to a Church of England school, but a Church of England church, sorry. But they were more like Pentecostal, but they still have the Queen as the head of state, and we have the Archbishop.
Gotcha. So there's quite a bit of a hierarchy system when it comes to the Church of England. Is it a lot like the Catholic Church in some ways? That kind of.
Yeah. But very similar.
Okay. Now, but there are a few churches, like when you say Pentecostal, that is not Church of England, correct?
Yeah, that's not Church of England. So we have different Pentecostal churches. We have a lot of African churches. So, there's variation. Like our church is joining a Pentecostal church called the New Testament Church of God, but we're still in a Church of England building.
And so how does that work? Does the government own the church buildings? Do they own the churches and stuff?
The Church of England will own the church buildings, yeah. It's government owned. So
the Church of England is more of an arm of the monarchy than it is the government. Is that how it works? Or I mean, it's really
more that the associated with the Queen and laws. So the Church of England is protected by the monarchy, by the Queen.
Okay,
the Queen is the head of the church, and then you've got the Archbishop.
So when I talked to Chris from the Not Your Typical Christian, he was talking about how, church and state, they really, really keep them separated, and, in the UK, and they're really pretty staunch about it. So when you look at it from that perspective, does the monarchy just give guidance to the state and the state does its own thing? Is that kind of how it works a little bit?
It might do. I'm not familiar with the entwined politics of it, really.
Okay.
I know that the Church of England, they after the answer to the bishops, and then the bishops, there is that hierarchy, and then the answer up, and then you have High Church of England, you have Low Church of England.
Wow. I mean, to the states, we just don't. It's completely different. That's why I'm curious about it, and just prying a little bit. So, while we're locked down, I mean, people can still check out your music and really, tap into songs that you've already done. Are you guys on Spotify? Do you have any social media? What's up with that?
Yeah. We've got a website, peter118.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify. Just Google Peter118. Google Peter118 on YouTube. You'll find us there. Okay.
And so, we'll go ahead and link to all this in the description as well. But, and so do you guys interact quite a bit with your Facebook page or your Twitter accounts? Do you talk to fans and stuff like that too?
Facebook and Twitter. I'm always posting updates and new pictures. And then, Facebook, people message us or get involved in the group discussions on, when the punk groups on in Facebook.
Awesome. Well, that's great, man. I know what this schedule is like right now. I appreciate you taking the time, out this morning to talk to us. And, it's just been awesome to hear from you, Peter, man. And
thank you.
We're going to keep up with you. We'll post your stuff on our website. Whenever we have a guest, we always put in their Spotify playlists and things of that nature, especially if they're a band. So we'll have a link to that in the description too, folks. If you want to check out who Peter 118 is and everything that they're doing, that'll be listed in there as well. So again, Peter, man, it's been awesome. I really appreciate you coming on the show. We'll be following your career, and we'll really, really be looking to, retweet. And when you come out with new information, it'll definitely go into the Song and Verse Ministry. So
yeah, thank you, Todd. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, this is Rocking Odd Todd signing out for this episode. And remember, love God, love people, and love Pat. You guys take care.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Song and Verse podcast. Hopefully it was an uplifting, honest, and meaningful experience for you. We do accept donations. If you feel led to give to the Song and Verse Ministries, check out songandverseministries.com/donate for a number of different ways to give back. And also be sure to check us out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest. We hope you tune into the next episode of the Song and Verse podcast. Until then, keep searching for the DNA of God's Word found flowing through song.